If you'd like to know how your chainsaw gets that very annoying limp recoil rope and how to rectify it, then keep watching this video, because I'm just about to explain. Hello and welcome, and in this video I'm going to go through some possible causes as to why you get limp recoil rope on your chainsaw. Because there's many causes of this, we'll have to take off the recoil housing itself to have a look inside at what's going on. This one has 4 bolts to be removed. But as you can see, I'm not going into a specific brand of chainsaw, but once the recoil's been removed, I like to have a visual check all around. Does the pulley look okay? Is there any cracks and damage anywhere on the pulley or around on the casing? If yours has starter dog gears like this on the pulley, are they okay? Is there any wear to them? Is there anything that looks like it would be catching, stopping this recoil from operating correctly? But if you take the cord and pull it out and you find that it's springing back in quite nicely without the feeling of anything catching, then it could be that it just needs retensioning to take up the slack of the cord. And all we need to do to remedy that is to take this part of the cord between the pulley and the eyelet outlet, and then there's a special place there on the pulley, a little groove, and the string is to be put inside that groove, and then turn the whole pulley into the tension of the spring. In this case it's clockwise. You may indeed need to do this more than once to get enough tension on the spring, so when it does spring back there's enough tension on the spring there to pull that cord back in nicely. And the main reason you might find yourself having to do this is because the recoil spring, like any spring, does weaken slightly after use over time. And so, like any spring, sometimes they just need retensioning and you're good to go. So it might not mean that the spring is actually damaged. But one thing we must make sure of when we've tensioned the spring is that when we pull the string out to its fullest extent, that the pulley stops as a result of no more string left on it, rather than the spring being pulled to the end of its tension, because this would ultimately put too much stress on the spring and cause damage. But I'll explain a little bit more about this later on in the video and show you how to overcome this if this is an issue. But assuming that spring tension isn't the cause and so that's not the issue, if it is that when you pull the remainder of the cord out but it's not springing back with ease, it feels like it's catching, it could well be that the recoil spring behind the pulley is somewhat dirty and rusty, and all it needs is a little bit of lubrication. I normally use some light oil. I find it much easier using the extendable straw pipe, and I give it a good spray around the back of the pulley and in the centre. I then work that oil in by repeatedly pulling the cord so it turns the pulley and working the rust and dirt out of the spring. It's likely to take a good few minutes to work in, but it could remedy your problem. And if you do find this works, then fantastic. But if you are indeed stuck with the same problem, then we need to look into it deeper. So leaving the recoil cord and the handle in situ, I would try just loosening the centre screw slightly, taking some tension off it, and see if that makes a difference. Because although when these screws are tightened in nice and tightly, they're set in such a way that the pulley can still move, I have in the past had situations where just loosening the screw in the centre has allowed the spring to operate again, and so that's indicated to me that there's been something binding. Maybe it's a piece of dirt or something that somehow got jammed behind the pulley, or somebody may have had the recoil off previously and put it together slightly wrong, used the wrong types of washers, etc. And so these are all things that we would find out as we keep looking. And so in that case, we need to remove the pulley anyway. But before we do, if there is tension now on this spring that we know of, then we must remove the tension of the spring, so that when we remove the pulley, it will come off easier and there's less chance of causing any damage to the spring. I find it best to pull this part of the string, pulling off some rope from the pulley. I then intermittently hold the pulley with my thumb, stopping it from springing backwards. I then take this part of the rope and I place it into that notch cutout on the edge of the pulley. And I allow the spring to turn the pulley back, in this case it's counterclockwise, 1 full turn. And then it should have took the tension from the spring. If it needs 2 rotations backwards, then that's no problem, we can do that, as long as there's no tension on that spring. So really what we're looking to get here, if we haven't already got a limp recoil rope, then we're looking to get a limp recoil rope, and we can do the next step. And that next step is to remove the centre retaining screw that holds the pulley in place. And so in this case I need my Phillips headed screwdriver. And now, simply leaving the cord in situ on the handle and the pulley, I just lift off the pulley, leaving behind the recoil spring. And now's the time to have a really good look around the pulley and see if there's any damage or anything that was chafing, any reason whatsoever as to why this recoil wasn't operating correctly. And so after a good initial inspection, if all looks okay, then we need to have a look at the recoil spring itself, so we need to remove that. And the best way to remove it is to turn the recoil housing upside down and knock it on the table. And there we should have the recoil spring. And hopefully it's still neatly packed into its housing like this. And now after a good visual inspection of the recoil spring to see if we can see anything obviously wrong with it, any damage or anything hanging off it, etc. To really know if it's functioning correctly, then it would be beneficial to know how it functions. And so simply put, when it's all in situ inside the recoil housing, the recoil pulley sits on top of the recoil spring just like this. And then when the recoil cord is pulled, it of course unwinds the cord off the pulley and thus turns it. No surprise there, but as it turns, there's an opening in the pulley that allows the protruding area of the spring to fit into, and as the pulley turns, it turns the spring in this direction. The more the pulley turns, the more tension's being put on that spring. You can see that by the spring coils getting smaller and smaller as more tension is loaded onto them. And so spring steel, being of course spring steel, it has memory and it wants to go back to those larger coils again. So as soon as it's allowed to do so and I take the tension off the cord, then they will spring back to those larger coils. And that of course spins the pulley back the opposite way and pulls the cord back in. And so now we can get the picture of how this works. Okay, so what does a damaged recoil spring look like? Well, let's compare one to our recoil spring. And instantly you can see that there's some huge differences there. We're under no illusion as to which one is the damaged one. You can see all of this rust and the breaks in the spring steel. Well, this spring is completely scrap, so we couldn't use it anyway. But if we take a look at this area here that's supposed to fit into the notch on the pulley, we can see that it should be further out like this. Otherwise it won't be out enough to firmly fit into the notch on the pulley, and of course it would then slip, not allowing the pulley to be recoiled back in properly. And you can see some obvious differences there between these two of how far the ends of the recoil springs actually protrude into the centre. In fact, I have seen situations in the past where the catchment area of the spring here is completely missing, so it's broken off. And obviously if this is missing, there'll be no recoil action at all. And similarly, I've seen damage to this end of the spring where there's a break, allowing the whole spring to rotate inside the housing. And this of course is highly likely to result in a limp recoil rope. So upon inspection, if we find either of these two problems, then we need a new recoil spring. But however, having the ends of these springs in good order is one thing, but where they're placed on the recoil pulley is another. Comparing these two recoil pulleys, for example, there are some very important differences. Taking a look at the one on the left, at the notch cutout where the recoil spring fits into, you can see that the face of it that contacts the spring is in good condition. It's still structured in an upright position with a good edge, and so there's minimal wear to it. Now let's compare that to the one on the right. We can see that we haven't got that upright position and we haven't got such a fine edge. It's obvious that this is worn away over continued usage over time. And you can see the extent of this wear clearly when they're side by side. And this level of damage would undoubtedly cause some slippage to the spring, and so of course cause a limp recoil rope. And in my opinion, if the pulley does show this level of damage, then it really is best to buy a new one. I do know people that have had some success by filing the end back to a nice straight edge, but personally I'd prefer to buy a new pulley. Before this, however, when you came to remove your recoil spring, if this happened, then there's no need to panic because we can soon sort this as well. But in some cases you might find out that there's been a mix-up and you don't know which way the spring should fit back in. But a good way to find this out is to wind some rope onto the pulley, and then once the pulley's put in its place, there should be a straight line of rope through the eyelet and then coming onto this side of the pulley, the most direct and quickest route onto the pulley. If the rope was wound onto the pulley the wrong way, then it would look like this. It would be going through a bend rather than a straight line. It just doesn't operate at all this way. But when you've got it the right way, and then when you pull the rope out, the important thing here is to see which way the pulley rotates. And we can see this is clockwise. And so now from that we can work out which way round we need to refit this spring. because we know from earlier that the groove in the pulley fits onto this area of the spring and pulls the spring into this direction, making those coils smaller. And so we know for definite it doesn't go this way where it makes those coils larger, because it's the spring action itself that springs back to those larger coils. It isn't moved that way by the pulley. And so now we found out that the clockwise movement of the pulley will move the spring this way in the right direction. We can now start to refit the spring. So basically we need to get all of these coils back into this housing in this position. And so all I've done now is turn them upside down as they were and place them on the table. Then I take the housing and I place the first part of the spring in the special notch. And then holding this part in with my thumb, I bend the coil like this and put it in place at the wall of the housing. I then slide my thumb down to secure this part of the spring whilst I'm bending the next piece into place. And I just continue doing it with this technique all the way round until all of the coils are in place inside the housing. And so after taking the recoil apart, if there was any problem with either the rope, the pulley, the housing or the spring, and it's now been rectified, then we can now start to put it back together. When I've securely put the recoil spring back into place, I like to give it a shot of oil just to keep off any rust for as long as possible. And so because we didn't remove the rope, which now makes it easier and quicker now we're putting it back together, we can now simply continue to wind it back onto the pulley in the direction that the rest of it was already on there. And one thing to note is we don't need to wind it all on there at the moment. We need to keep around about a foot of limp rope. And before we place the pulley onto the spring, we must make sure that the protruding part of the spring fits into the notch on the back of the pulley. And then we'll refit the retaining screw and tighten it up nicely, and then just make sure this is nice and free, which it is. And then as before, we take this part of the rope, we put it into the notch, we turn it clockwise against the spring and create some tension on there. And if it doesn't feel like it's enough tension, then we can repeat that process, go round once more. And at that, this particular one's at enough tension to pull that recoil rope back in nicely. But again, pull the rope right out and make sure that the rope ends on the pulley before the spring gets up to its maximum tension, else otherwise it will cause further damage to the spring. And so how do we know if it is undesirably maxing out on the spring tension? Well, I pull the string out until it stops, and then I try and turn the pulley that little bit further, and hopefully there's a nice free half a turn or so more there. But on mine, it's very difficult to turn, and I can tell there's a lot of tension on that spring. I do get the feeling that it's maxing the spring out somewhat, so I don't want to leave it at this tension because of future damage. But just quickly while we're on this particular subject, another way of preventing the spring from becoming over tight is to simply pull the string out to its maximum and then take a look at the pulley to see if there's any more rope on the pulley. And if there's no more rope on the pulley, then that suggests that it's just simply run out of rope rather than it being maxed out on the spring. However, I do find this method a little less reliable, because at this point it still could be or very near to maxing out on the spring as well. So it's always best to try and turn the pulley when you've pulled the string right out, and then we know for definite. And so what do we do if we find out that the spring is maxing out? Well, what I do is this. I take hold of the rope and then I release one turn of spring tension, so that now we're left with a limp cord again. I then push this excess cord up through the handle, just to take out the slack that's there. And I pull the string out enough to make a new knot in the correct place that just takes up that slack, without putting any extra tension on the spring. And whilst we've lost a couple of inches off the rope, we've no longer got a limp cord and there'll be less tension on that spring. And let's see how much tension this does free up without giving that limp cord. So in the situation before we've made the adjustments with the over-tight spring, we'll take our complete recoil and we'll put a mark on the pulley there, and then we'll put another mark on the housing behind it. And then we'll pull the recoil string until it stops, whilst counting how many times these two marks pass each other. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so we've got 5 turns into the tension of the spring. And so now let's have a look how many turns we've got when we've made the adjustment. Well, straight away you can see that the mark is in a completely different place, as if it's come half a turn back. But let's see how many turns of tension into the spring there are now exactly. So I've made my new mark on the housing and we'll see how many times these two marks pass now. 1, 2, 3, 4 and a half. So the spring did indeed become half a turn less tense. So now we've got a recoil without a limp recoil rope, and we know that the recoil spring is not under too much load. And now what do we do with this excess piece of rope? Well, if it's not too long, we can just tuck it in there into the handle, but I personally prefer to be a little neater and cut off the excess. And to prevent the ends of this rope from fraying, I simply singe the ends with a cigarette lighter and then wipe it with an old cloth immediately, and then that will give it a lovely professional looking finish. And I want to thank you so much for watching this video, and please do take a look down in the description below where I've got some links to my website for some free downloads. I've designed these to help with diagnostics, troubleshooting and repairs of two-stroke engines, mainly chainsaws. The best of it is they're printable, so you can take them into the workshop with you and work at your own pace. There are some paid downloads, but most of them are and will continue to be free. And I shall be continuing to add new free content here, so please do keep your eyes on this side of the site. And in the meantime, I shall be back soon. Thank you for watching.